Is everyone good? Shall we just continue?
Good.
Okay, well, all of you talking about hiking and utterly exhausted, so if you don't mind, I'm going to sit while I take you on a virtual tour of the Point San Luis Light Station. And a couple of things I would ask. One, if you would silence your electronic devices. I'm talking to you, dear. You just kind of turn it off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep going, and then I'm going to stop periodically and ask if there are questions and comments. So if that's okay with you, to hold your questions and comments until I pause. But if you have questions that you think of while I'm talking, make sure you write them down if you don't want to forget them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Will we have access to the slides?
Yes, we have access to the slides. We'll figure out how to do that.
Right. Thank you.
Absolutely. So the Point San Luis Light Station, it's located at the northernmost tip of San Luis Bay. Of course, Point Sal is the southernmost tip of San Luis Bay. It's very near the town of Avila Beach, and it's close to about 10 miles from the city of San Luis Obispo. It's about 200 miles south of the Bay Area, and it's about 200 miles north of Los Angeles. But of course, you already know that, right? Yeah. This image shows the light station in relation to Piedras Blancas to the north and Point Conception to the south. So in 1890, before the Point San Luis Light Station was built, there was a distance of 94 unlighted or unlit miles between Piedras Blancas and Point Conception for mariners to try to navigate. So the Point San Luis Light Station was needed to serve as a primary coast light and also as a guide into Port Hartford. Now we call it Port San Luis, but back then until 1908 it was Port Hartford, which had considerable passenger and freight steamship traffic. By the late 1880s, Port Hartford was handling over 400 steamers. Here's an aerial view of the light station, and I'll maybe just briefly describe the layout of it. So if you see the circle near the top of the screen, and you see kind of the end of the road leading into it, the circle is where the Slow Safe Ride van typically will let your guests off, and then they make their way up the slight hill to start the tour at the historic portion of the site. The next roof that you see right from the circle, those are the restrooms. Of course, they're not historic, but they're very useful. And then after that, also on the left side, is the 1948 cinder block duplex that was built by the Coast Guard to house 2 Coast Guard families. There is a family, and I think probably all of you know that's living in part of that duplex. They provide some informal security for the light station because the family lives there. And then moving up in the center of the slide, you'll see a red roof, a long red roof. That's our administration building. That's the building that the Coast Guard built in 1960. It's the 1960 or the West duplex. And then the 2 circles that you see in front of that are the 2 cisterns, which have just recently been restored. To the, let's say the right of the 2 circles, the 2 white circles, the cisterns, that's the fog signal building and the coal house. And then coming down, there's the headkeeper's dwelling and the attached lighthouse. Now the little red building that you see that's right at the edge of the bluff is the kerosene house. And then over on the far left is a restored barn. It's used basically for storing various equipment and supplies. So that's just a brief aerial view of the light station. Here's a view of the 2-mile narrow, winding, 1-lane road that the Slow Safe Ride uses to take guests up Lighthouse Road from the entrance to the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. The road is owned and controlled by PG&E. It's only about 10 feet wide. It's very close to the edge of the bluff. In 1890, there were only two ways to reach the light station, by water or by foot, because the road wasn't built until the early 1960s. Visitors can still come by water today. They can kayak or paddleboard in, or visitors can hike, as you all know, the Pecho Coast Trail to the Lighthouse, led by PG&E docents. PG&E controls and maintains the trail because most of it is on their property. So we'll begin our tour here, and on an in real life tour. This is a little bit up the road from the circle where the Slow Safe Ride shuttle bus drops guests off. The rope swing on the left that you see is no longer there. Guests who have been to the light station before might ask about what happened to the swing. I guess the short answer is that it was deemed a liability by the Harbor District. The white picket fence on the right signals the beginning of the historic portion of the site, which dates from 1890. Behind the picket fence is the back of a double outhouse. It's a two-seater privy that was used by the assistant keepers and their families. Next is the west duplex. That's the one-story building which in 1960 replaced the original Victorian duplex where the head keepers, two assistants, and their families lived. And the building with the red roof, in the distance straight ahead, is the fog signal building. So this historic image that was taken in 1894, so 4 years after the lighthouse opened, shows what the original Victorian duplex looked like. Notice the rain barrel on the right, used to collect rainwater diverted from the roof through gutters and downspouts. And there was another rain barrel on the other side of the duplex for the other family. Notice the center balcony on the second level, which the two assistants keepers shared. Here's another view of the original Victorian duplex, also taken in 1894, in which you can see both of the rain barrels, and each rain barrel could hold 12,000 gallons of water. So as we continue our walk up the road, we can see the door to the fog signal building's sitting room, which is now our gift shop, straight ahead. The steps leading down to our outdoor event venue on the left, the west duplex on the near right, and the head keeper's dwelling and attached lighthouse on the far right. This is a view of our outdoor event venue. In this case, it's set up for a wedding. As Deb mentioned, and you probably all know, we also hold a series of summertime concerts at the venue, and our lineup for 2025 has already been announced, and many tickets have already been sold. On the left, you can see the breakwater, which protects the Port San Luis Harbor and pier. So back up the steps from the outdoor event venue, here's another view on the right of the west duplex, which is now our administration building. And continuing along the road, we'll walk by a restored tripod used to render whale oil. It's a nod to the 20 years beginning in 1867, when Point San Luis was used as a whaling station. So the first stop on this tour, and by the way, as docents, you will start at different places. When the bus comes up, or bus lets guests off at the circle and people make their way up the slight rise to the front of the gift shop, they're usually divided into groups of 2 or 3, depending upon how many guests there are and how many docents that we have, and then the docents work out beforehand among themselves who's going to start where, because the rooms in the head keeper's dwelling aren't big enough to accommodate 25 people at one time. So, but in this case, for our virtual tour, we're going to make our first stop here at the Lighthouse. And after it was completed, a notice to mariners announced that on or about June 30, 1890, a light of the 4th order, showing red and white flashes alternately, with intervals of 30 seconds between flashes, will be exhibited from the structure recently erected at San Luis Obispo. The light is shown from a black lantern surmounting a square frame tower attached to the southwest corner of a 1.5-story frame dwelling painted white, with gray trim and a brown roof. Now the way that the lighthouse looks during the day is called its day marks. Each light station was built or painted to look different from other lighthouses in the areas to help mariners figure out where they were. However, Point San Luis was one of a set of triplets. The same design was used at Ballast Point in Southern California inside the entrance to San Diego Bay, also built in 1890 but demolished in 1950, and in Northern California up in Humboldt at Table Bluff, built in 1892 but dismantled in the 1980s. However, since these 3 light stations were so very far apart, it wouldn't have been a problem for mariners that their day marks all looked the same. So our tour continues up the steps and into the head keeper's dwelling, entering through the gray door with the white panels into the center hallway. On one side of the center hallway is the staircase to the 2nd floor and the kitchen and the pantry. On the other side is the sitting room and the front parlor. Once inside, we're going to make an immediate left and open the door to the kitchen. One of the kitchen windows is to the left of the front door. So as we enter the kitchen, notice the decorative crown molding strips at the ceiling, the beadboard ceiling and walls, and the brown baseboards, all made of redwood. And notice the tongue and groove flooring, which is made of Douglas fir. Here we can see the stove, the kerosene lamp on the ledge behind the stove, and the pots and pans on the stovetop. The brown door leads into the adjacent pantry. Now, I mentioned the stove and the pots and pans and the kerosene lamp because aside from the dwelling itself, that's about all the lighthouse service provided to its keepers in the way of furnishings. Guests may ask you if the furniture in the house is original. No, you can tell them it is not. Keepers typically worked at multiple lighthouses during their careers, and when they moved to a new assignment, they would take their furniture with them or sell it to the new family moving in if they were leaving the lighthouse service. Notice the pantry cabinet on the left with shelves and glass doors above the counter and the drawers and doors below. It's exactly what the pantry cabinet looked like in 1890. Notice the hand pump over the sink and the views of San Luis Bay from the kitchen windows. Now, those views from the kitchen windows might have been obstructed by the keeper's rain barrel if we look at this image that was taken in 1894. Just like the Victorian duplex had a barrel on each side for the assistant keepers, the head keeper had a rain barrel also. This rain barrel isn't here now, but there are plans to restore it in the future as funds permit. Here's another view of the stove and the attached hot water tank. The stove burned coal and not wood because there were no trees on the 30-acre light station in 1890. The trees were planted later by the keepers. And it was easier and cheaper for the lighthouse service tender ship to deliver coal to the light station rather than wood. The door on the right is the door that we used to enter the kitchen, just to get you oriented. Now, if you walked into this kitchen at dinner time in the summer of 1890, you would have met our first head keeper, Captain Henry Wilson Young, age 52 at the time, his wife Mercedes, age 36, and their 4 children, Harry, Frank, Mary, and Joe, ages 10, 9, 7, and 6. And you would have met them having their evening meal in this cozy kitchen in front of this cozy coal-burning stove. We've yet to find a photo of Captain Young, at least not one where he's positively identified, from Point San Luis to the Alcatraz light station.
Alcatraz, that's a fun fact.
Alcatraz light station. So before it was a prison, Alcatraz was a light station. In fact, the Alcatraz light station was the very first lighthouse built in California in 1854. And it's kind of fun sometimes when you're maybe in the lens room or maybe at some stop on your tour and you talk about the first lighthouse built in California, and then you say to your guests, but of course you all know the first lighthouse built in California, and they look at you blankly, and then you can say to them, yeah, you do. You all know. 100% guaranteed you all know. You just don't think of it as a lighthouse. Excuse me, I'm violating my own rule here. You think of it as a prison. It's a fun thing to say. But the man in this 1894 photo, standing in front of the fog signal building sitting room, could be Captain Young. I know that the sign in the mini museum in the fog signal building identifies this keeper as Antonio Souza. That's completely my fault. That's who I thought it was, but I have revised my thinking. So in 1894, the Lighthouse Service hired a photographer by the name of Herbert Bamber. And he was hired to take pictures of all of the light stations that were then in existence. And he came out to Point San Luis in, I think, March, maybe February, I can't recall, of 1894. And he took various pictures of the light station. And he took this picture. So, if Herbert Bamber were going to take a photograph of a keeper standing outside the watch room there, wouldn't you think it would have been the head keeper, Captain Young, that would have wanted his picture taken and not one of the assistant keepers? So I choose to believe that the man that you see in front of that watch room is Captain Henry Wilson Young. And the children, also photograph taken by Herbert Bamber in 1894, the children at the bottom of the steps in front of the head keeper's dwelling are probably two of Captain Young's children, most likely Mary and Joe. So, exiting the kitchen, we'll walk through the adjacent pantry on our way to the cellar. The pantry, with its easy access to the kitchen, would have been the perfect place to store some of the food rations that the Lighthouse Service tender ship delivered to the light station every few months. And these rations would have supplemented the food that the keepers caught in San Luis Bay, grew in their gardens, or got from their chickens and cows. The tender delivered staples like flour, sugar, coffee, potatoes, onions, beans, vinegar, and dried beef and dried pork. And there's a sign in the kitchen that says that. The cellar where we're going next would have also stored food rations. So leaving the pantry and entering the back of the center hallway, we'll make an immediate sharp right, open the cellar door, and begin to walk down the rough steps to the cellar using the plain handrail. Now it's up to you as a docent to decide to include the cellar on your tours. That's up to you. Perhaps assessing your group's ability to easily handle the steps and with an awareness of the extra time it takes to visit the cellar. I know that typically the hiking docents, the dual docents, will take hikers down to the cellar because they're pretty agile. Sometimes the docents who are doing the house tours for the people who come up on slow safe ride choose not to go down to the cellar because it adds time to the tour. And of course your tours are timed because there's going to be another tour following the first tour. You're going to do 2 tours a day if you're a house docent, and you need to be finished by the time that second group arrives. Anyway, before we head down to the cellar, do you have any questions up to this point or comments?
Do you know how often the tender ship came by?
Yes, so it used to come every 3 or 4 months or so, and I'll tell you how we know this. I'll go on that tangent. So we're very, very fortunate here at this lighthouse because we have a guest book, we have a visitor's register that's carefully preserved and not available so precious, but it dates from 1893. And when the tender ship would come down from Yerba Buena Island to deliver supplies, food rations, and the dreaded government inspector to the light station, the inspector would typically sign the guest register so we can see the frequency was 3 or 4 months. Later, it was less frequent. Pardon me?
What was he inspecting?
Okay, so imagine you have all of these light stations up and down the coast, west coast, right? And it's a very the Lighthouse Service was a very decentralized organization. You know, you had your keepers at Point San Luis, you had your keepers at Piedras Blancas, Point Conception, and so on. They were pretty much on their own. But oh no. Oh no, someone had to check up on them. So this tender ship would come and make the rounds and never come announced. And the inspector, which in 1890 was a naval officer, would come unannounced, you know, bringing the supplies, bringing the food, bringing the coal, bringing the kerosene. But his job was to inspect these light stations and make sure they were being run efficiently, that they were spick and span, that they were up to snuff. So that was the job of the inspector, like the boss, if you will. Any other questions or comments, Phil?
Yeah, Notice to Mariners also says green shades, and I'm not sure what they mean about green. I'm not sure the thing that you pull down, I call a blind rather than a shade. I've never seen those green, it would be hideous.
I feel like they're louvers.
Yeah, louvers, or well,
Or shutters, shutters.
Maybe they have rain shutters, but I've never
Yeah.
seen that. I've never seen the shutters
Yeah.
in any photograph.
Yeah.
And so, what does the green shades mean?
Yeah.
And I've never
I
seen
don't know.
anybody try to duplicate it.
And you notice that I leave that out of the Notice to Mariners because when I was doing this virtual tour, I didn't have a picture to show of the green shades, so I left that part off, the Notice to Mariners. So I kind of abbreviate what the Notice to Mariners actually said that was published right before the light was first lit on June 30, 1890. Yeah, good question. I don't think we have any photos of those green shades,
Yeah, I don't
green
even know what it
shutters.
means. And I've never seen the thing that I call blind. I've never seen those green. And I think it would be totally hideous. If you pull them down, you get green light coming through them. It would just,
I thought they were shutters, but I don't know.
yeah, I would assume they're like
they're
smoke
shutters.
Yeah.
Because we have a group of Tuesday work group people that are actually working on that right now. They're placing the shutters on the outside of the building, and we've got all the dimensions from reports from.
Yeah, 1889, yeah.
We got that, but the shutters were on the inside on some of the windows,
Okay.
not on, so the shutters that are on the outside I don't really know how it works, but Mike Fairbrother is the one that knows.
Well, that would explain why they're not in the pictures, because if they were on the inside, then
Yeah.
they wouldn't be in the pictures.
But some of them are on the outside.
So Mike Fairbrother is a person who has done a lot of the restoration work on the structures, on the dwellings. And what he uses as his Bible, and you can all Google this, it's online, the 1889 plans for building the head keeper's dwelling, for building the Victorian duplex, for building the fog signal building, for building the lighthouse tower. All of that was included in a set of plans that the federal government used because they put the job out to bid. And so whoever won the job, the contractor from Santa Barbara, that's a whole other story, it's in the book, lowball bid, lost his shirt. Used these very detailed plans in order to do all the building, and we have access to that because they're online. And so Mike Fairbrother and others who want to go back and try to figure out, well, how do I build that pantry that I showed you that was in the kitchen on the left with the glass doors and the drawers and the doors below? It's all described in the 1889 plans. So, yes.
On one of my first tours of the Lighthouse, the nonprofit was formed in 95. I don't remember who gave the tour, but the pantry had a laundry room attached to it, and you actually walked out the window and then there was a bathroom flush toilet upstairs. But I understand that all that had to be taken off in order to be compliant for grants and
Right,
to
so
restore it back
So the idea was that the lighthouse was, or the light station was restored to its period of historic significance, which was deemed to be 1890, and so the indoor plumbing that actually came in 1907 and the electricity that came in 1935, except for one room, and the head keeper's laundry room, that was all, what do I want to say? Yeah, removed. Thank you, short answer, removed, to bring it back to its period of historical significance.
And I remember the bathroom being a 1950s avocado green, remember that?
We actually have a picture of the entrance to that bathroom that was taken during, I want to say the Coast Guard years. So we have a picture of that, and then of course the people who did the restoration work would have seen that bathroom, which had, you know, a toilet and a sink and a full bathtub. But there's no indoor plumbing in the head keeper's dwelling because it's 1890 and there wasn't any indoor plumbing. The head keeper, just like the two assistant keepers had a two-seater privy, the head keeper had his own wash house and privy. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Anything else?
You mentioned on the tender ship, you were about to tell us how we knew they came later.
Oh, how
You
we
said
know
it was
that?
3-4 months based on the guest book.
Because of the signatures in the guest book, and because after a time they were no longer delivering as much fuel as they had before, because in 1890 our fog signal was a steam whistle, and in order to get the water to become steam, you needed a lot of coal. When the lighthouse upgraded from a steam whistle to an air siren, which was powered by compressed air, and I'll talk about this, you didn't need as much coal because you weren't needing to heat the water to produce the steam for the steam whistle. So that meant less frequent trips. Does that make sense? Okay.
So that meant they got less food then, or just it came later?
Yeah, and you know, the food thing is probably something that kind of tapered off over time, because if you think about it, it was fairly easy to get to town from the Point San Luis light station, right? I mean, the lighthouse gave you not only a house, but it gave you a boat. You could take the boat over to Hartford Pier, board at Hartford Pier, hop on the narrow gauge railroad, and then in 10 miles or 30 minutes, you're in San Luis Obispo. So maybe less need for government groceries over time. Okay, so we're down in the cellar now. We've decided to go down there with our guests. So we're looking back from the bottom of the stairs that we just descended. We can see the open cellar door on the left, and the paneled back door straight ahead, which leads to the outside and the head keeper's wash house and privy. Until 1907, as I just said, the dwelling had no indoor plumbing. So having descended the cellar steps, we'll turn right to enter the cellar. Notice the brick walls and the brickwork. While all of the structures except for one are made of wood, the foundations of all of the buildings are brick. The flooring in the cellar is concrete with a slight slope to a drain that we can't see in this photo. While there was no refrigeration in the house, of course, in 1890, the cellar would have kept things cool. However, it did tend to collect water during the winter, and there was also the problem of mice. Notice the redwood beams. Our docents like to challenge our guests to see if they can hear any creaks when they walk on the floorboards on the first floor. The beams are a testament to how solidly the dwelling was constructed by the Santa Barbara contractor who lost his shirt building it. As we leave the cellar and ascend back up the stairs, notice the arched brickwork where the shelving is and the arches over the cellar windows, a testament to the craftsmanship of the masons who laid the bricks. So now we're back on the first floor. We'll cross the hallway and we'll enter the sitting room, used by some families as a dining room. Notice how shallow the fireplaces. The fireplaces didn't burn wood, they burned coal, just like the stove did. And notice the kerosene lamps. Electricity didn't come to the light station until 1935. Here's a closer look at the dining table and the dish on display. This one dish is an original with the turquoise insignia of the United States Lighthouse Service. It was a donation to the lighthouse. So if you look out the window on the left, you can just make out a plaque mounted on a post, and it marks the spot where the keeper's outhouse was located. And the railings outside the windows are part of an accessible ramp leading up to the dwelling's back door, installed in recent years to assist guests who have mobility challenges. So if you are a docent and you are touring with guests who have come up on the Slow Safe Ride shuttle bus, you might have a guest on your tour who is using a walker or who is using a wheelchair, and there is a ramp that starts behind the administration building that will take those guests around to the back door of the head keeper's dwelling, so at least they can tour the first floor of the light station. Unfortunately, they're not going to be able, most likely, to climb the steps to the second floor, or nor to climb the stairs up to the tower and the lantern room. So here,
Can I ask a question?
yes, of course.
For safety reasons with somebody who's handicapped, are they responsible to have someone with them to move them around and support them versus docents?
That's a really good question, and
Yes.
I've seen it both ways. They are supposed to have somebody who is assisting them.
No.
They are supposed to have somebody who's assisting them. Did you hear what I just said? Okay. So here's an historical image of the Keeper's Wash House on the left and Privy on the right. And the girl and boy are probably Mary and Joe, the two children that we saw earlier.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think you had said the dual outhouse had been restored?
Say again?
The dual outhouse had been restored, you had said, one of the outhouses?
Oh, yes, I'll show you a picture of it again, but there is, if you're walking up the hill from where the Slow Safe Ride bus or shuttle bus drops guests off, and you go up, the first thing you're gonna see after you pass that 1948 cinder block duplex, and you're at that white picket fence, and right beyond the white picket fence, up on a slight hill, is the outside of the two-seater privy or two-station privy that the two assistant keepers and their families used. But it's not part of the tour, and I have no idea what the inside looks like. I have never
Full of
opened
Christmas
it.
decorations.
No, I'm sure it's full of Christmas. Every closet in the house is full of Christmas decorations. So, yeah,
Everything's been removed.
it's the exterior has been restored, so you can point to it and say, well, that's the two-seater privy that the two assistant keepers and their families
Is
used.
the interior restored as well?
I do not know.
No,
No? Okay.
it's just a room storage.
Okay.
Storage.
Yeah.
Oh, the window. So notice the window straight ahead of us, which leads to the side porch. It extends all the way down to the floor, and the lower sash slides up into the wall above it. There's a window just like it in the next room, the front parlor. Now, I imagined when the Lighthouse Service inspector made his surprise visits 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, in 1890, this would have been the naval officer charged with ensuring that lighthouses in his district were being run efficiently and were spick and span, that Captain and Mrs. Young would have entertained the inspector, the unwelcome inspector, serving him lunch or dinner. And then after the meal, I imagine that the captain and the inspector would have retired to the side porch, maybe to smoke a cigar or light a pipe, and to do this, they would simply have opened the window and stepped right through. So this is our view of this was our view. It's not quite the same now, thank heaven. This is our view as we step outside the window onto the side porch. The fog signal building is on the right. The two cisterns are straight ahead, one behind the other, and our administration building and flagpole are just beyond. Here's a closer look at the two cisterns, built of brick, lined with cement, and covered with tongue and groove boards. Each cistern is 28 feet in diameter and can hold 50,000 gallons of water. Now, the cisterns were recently restored, and so this photo was taken before their restoration. The restored two-seat privy, partially restored, I guess we'll say, since it wasn't restored inside, is on the hill on the left. And here's a closer look at that double privy where the Christmas decorations are stored. A woman who lived at the light station as a child, this was Lucy, remembered that she had a tricycle. No, it wasn't Lucy, I lied, this was Judy. She remembered that she had a tricycle, but the ground was rough, and so it was a joy for her to ride her tricycle on the boards that covered the cisterns. But the possibility that the boards might break and plunge her into the water simply terrified her parents. And she recalls to this day, Judy does, the spanking that she received when her father, the keeper, caught her one time riding her tricycle at this forbidden spot.
Do you know how many feet deep?
I don't. I do, but I don't. It's in my notes, but I don't have it top
I
of
would say
mind.
they're about 10, 12 feet deep.
So if you figure they're 28 feet in diameter and each can hold 50,000 gallons of water, there's probably a mathematical equation you can do to figure out how deep they are, but I don't have it top of mind.
10 feet is big.
Yeah, they may be even deeper than that, because I would remember when they were restoring them, they didn't have the tops on them, and they had ladders
Yeah.
to go down into them. So
And you could stand
maybe-
up inside and you'd still be,
Yeah.
way up
They're
below
pretty
the
deep.
How many gallons did you say this for?
50,000.
Each one of them?
Each one can hold 50,000 gallons of water. The station's cement rainwater catch basin, built on an incline, collected water for the cisterns, and then during the dry season, water was piped to the cisterns from a spring, Pecho Creek, about 4 miles away. Here's another outside view showing the side porch, the fog signal building, and the coal shed, which is this little postage stamp size piece of property where the old coal shed is, surrounded by a chain link fence and barbed wire. That was the only piece that was not deeded over to the harbor district by the government. It's still owned by the government. I believe it's still owned by the Coast Guard, leased perhaps to Vandenberg Space Force Base. But in any event, it's under the control. It's not part of the property that was deeded over to the harbor district. The small black cylinder on top of the platform straight ahead is our current light, and it flashes a 1 second white flash every 4 seconds. I used to say as a docent that it flashed a 1 second white flash every 4 seconds between sunset and sunrise, but lately it's been flashing a 1 second flash every 4 seconds. Seems like 24/7, so
Yeah.
something changed. We're going to step back through the window and into the dining room again, but before we do, let me stop again and see if anybody has any questions or comments, anything like that. Yes, sir.
Where's Venture Coast Creek?
About 4 miles west. I have never hiked to Rattlesnake Canyon. I don't know if one encounters Pecho Creek or the dam that was built there.
There is a creek just
The
before
pipe,
we get
the extra creek is at the 2.4 mile mark on the PG&E road,
Okay.
but there's a pipe still,
Oh, yeah.
feeding the
Yeah.
lighthouse from it, but it's not used.
So those pipes were laid in
And the creek is,
Pecho Creek,
yeah,
it's at the coast.
it's westerly, yeah.
okay.
It's off the Diablo Canyon access road, about
Okay.
2.5 miles.
Do we see it on the Rattlesnake?
No,
And apparently there's an old dam up there, but that's not on the Rattlesnake.
no, the earthen dam was blown out and one of the El
So the story
I
is,
have one more. Is
Yeah.
it cement, 130 years old, that catch basin cement?
yeah, dates from
Okay.
1890, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely. So,
That's why it's
you know,
crumbling.
we're a light station because not only do we have a lighthouse, but we had, we don't have now, we had a fog signal. And when the light was first lit on June 30, 1890, they couldn't sound the fog signal. They couldn't sound it because it was June 30th and there wasn't any rainfall. So there wasn't any water in the cisterns to use to produce steam. So what the Lighthouse Service did was they bought water rights. They actually bought them twice, but they had forgotten, I guess, that they had bought them the first time. So they paid $100 a second time to buy water rights from Luigi Murray and the daughter of Captain John Wilson and his wife.
Ramona Pacheco.
Yes, exactly. So her daughter Ramona Hilliard and Murray kind of owned this creek. It was maybe the dividing line between their two properties. I don't know. So anyway, the Lighthouse Service buys the water rights and then hires laborers to lay these pipes from a dam that was constructed all the way to the lighthouse. This is kind of a gravity-fed system of pipes, and so they were finally able to sound the fog signal in August of 1890. So not June 30, but in early August, they were finally able to fill the cisterns up with water from the creek and then be able to sound the fog signal. Any other questions or comments? So we're back inside the dining room. We've pulled down the window. We noticed the ample light provided by the room's 3 windows. The brown door ahead and to our right takes us into the front parlor. And as we enter the parlor, which is the largest room in the house because of these protruding bay windows, notice the window that leads to the side porch, which is just like the one in the dining room. Notice the period furniture and the lighthouse keeper's jacket and hat. And notice these curtain bay windows. So here's a closer look at the keeper's jacket and hat. Notice the K embroidered on the jacket's lapels. The K signifies that the wearer was the head keeper. That's a capital K, keeper. Assistant keepers wore uniforms too, and jackets with embroidery on their lapels, but instead of the K, there would have been a number 1, 2, 3, or occasionally 4, depending upon how many assistant keepers there were at a light station. At Point San Luis, we had 3 keepers, a head keeper, a first assistant, and a second assistant. And if you want to see a picture of a first assistant keeper with his lighthouse jacket on and the number 1 embroidered on his lapel, it's in the Fog Signal building in the mini museum. He was our longest serving keeper, Antonio Silva. Never wanted to be a head keeper, very happy being an assistant keeper, but there's a formal portrait of him wearing his jacket with the number 1 on his lapel. Notice the views of San Luis Bay from the bay windows and the peaked metal roof of the oil house outside, which was used to store the kerosene. Here's another view of the oil house located about 70 feet south of the lighthouse, right at the edge of the bluff. It's a fireproof brick building. It's the only building not built of wood. It's covered with cement mortar and has a heavy steel door. The inside has a concrete floor and was fitted with shelves designed to hold 960 gallons of kerosene in 5-gallon cans. Also notice the peaked metal roof and the decorative wood brackets, which give it a certain style, not usually found in light station oil houses, at least not on the West Coast, which were typically strictly utilitarian. This is the fireplace in the front parlor. Notice the grate for the coal. The fireplace mantle has an interesting story. It went missing after the station was abandoned. It was abandoned when the last Coast Guard family left in December of 1975. The mantelpiece the dwelling's restoration began, an appeal went out asking those who might have any authentic items to return them with no questions asked and heartfelt thanks. And this mantle was one of the items that was returned. It had been stored in a garage in Arroyo Grande for over 20 years. I live in Arroyo Grande. I promise you I did not have it. One corner was damaged when and how, we don't know. Notice the picture on the right side of the mantle. It's a picture of Fred Saunders. He's our 4th head keeper and our only bachelor keeper. The other 4 keepers who lived in the head keeper's dwelling were married and came to the light station with families. So before we leave the parlor, a little history. So beginning in 1789, lighthouses were run by the federal government and operated by civilian keepers. Our first president, George Washington, recognized or understood the importance of maritime traffic to the economic prosperity of our new nation. And so he convinced our first Congress, as our 8th or 9th act of Congress, 8th or 9th piece of legislation, to put all the lighthouses then in existence under federal government control. So 150 years later, Lighthouse Service is planning a big celebration. It's the 150th anniversary of the Lighthouse Service, 1939. FDR has said that the week of August 11th, that was the date that that legislation was passed in 1789, could be Lighthouse Week. The Lighthouse Service is planning a big party. They're gonna bake a big cake. They're gonna put 150 candles on that cake, but right before that cake gets baked, FDR has another idea, and he transfers responsibility for our nation's aids to navigation to the United States Coast Guard. So Washington federalizes our nation's lighthouses, and FDR militarizes our nation's lighthouses. And if you think that decision went down well with people who were working for the Lighthouse Service at that time, you have another thing coming. The inspector at the time, who was no longer a naval officer, he was a career civil servant, started in 1912. In 1939, in July, he writes to his recently retired boss, "I only hope we live to see the day when Congress regrets having sold us down the river." In any event, the Coast Guard's motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, always prepared. They come in, they replace civilian keepers, and they run the light station until the station was fully automated, and the last Coast Guard family left in 1975. So leaving the parlor, we'll cross the center hallway and begin to climb the stairs. At the foot of the stairs, notice the ornamental post, which is made of ash. People tell me, no, it's made of oak, and I say, no, it's made of ash. That's what the plan said in 1889, and I did have someone who knew a lot about wood on one of my tours confirm that in fact it is ash. So as we climb the staircase to the second floor, notice the beautiful craftsmanship of the balusters and the handrail, also made of ash. And arriving at the top of the stairs, we'll turn left into the first bedroom. The door to a second bedroom is also on the left. The first bedroom, which we used to call the master bedroom, but we don't call it that any longer, and we should take down the sign. The first bedroom, the primary bedroom, faces north and east. The bedroom is in the back of the house with no water views, also there's a door inside the room that opens to a second bedroom, and there's also a closet, which is why we think it's the primary bedroom. Our docents enjoy showing our guests the closet in the primary bedroom. It's quite small by modern standards, hardly a walk-in closet by any means, with clothes hooks instead of hangers. Now, people say that the closets didn't need to be large because lighthouse keepers and their families didn't have or didn't need many clothes, but I'm going to disagree. So the Smith family moved to the light station in 1905 after Captain Young transferred to Alcatraz. And the Smiths had 3 teenage daughters who were the toast of the town, Elsie, Edna, and Bessie, and they certainly had lots of clothes. They went to parties, they went to dances, they had dresses, they had frocks, and so on. But they likely kept their clothes in armoires and in trunks, as well as in these very tiny closets. So the second bedroom upstairs on the left has a door that opens from the hallway and another door that connects it to the first bedroom. And we call this room Sunny's room. It's a mirror image of the first bedroom, but it faces south and it has wonderful views of San Luis Bay. Sunny was Bob Moorfield's son. Bob Moorfield was our last head keeper during the Lighthouse years. He ultimately ended up joining the Coast Guard so he could continue to serve as a lighthouse keeper, but then he was referred to as the officer in charge. In any event, Sunny was Bob Moorfield's son, Robert Moorfield Jr., and Sunny and his dad, who was a single parent at the time, came to Point San Luis from the Alcatraz light station in 1926 when Sunny was only 3 years old. This is a picture of Sunny and his dad. It was taken at Alcatraz, not at Point San Luis. On top of the chest of drawers in Sunny's room is a group photo taken of the students and their teacher at the Port Schoolhouse, which served the Lighthouse children and the other children living at Port San Luis. Sunny's stepsister, Lucy, is standing at the far right, and Sunny is standing beside her. And at the other end is Burton Gross, who was the son of an assistant keeper, Elmer Gross. He's standing at the other side. Now, this photo was taken in the 1930s, and unfortunately, the photo doesn't include the schoolhouse itself. But this historical image of the Port School was taken in 1915. The school was built in 1910. It was gone by 1940. One student remembered that each child's family took a turn serving as the school janitor for a month. And that meant sweeping up at the end of each school day and lighting a fire in the potbelly stove before school started during the winter months. And the family on duty also raised and lowered the flag. And for that service, the family on duty received $10. So you got a $10 stipend for being the custodian of the schoolhouse for a month. I think it was actually the students who were supposed to be the custodians, but it ended up being the parents. Yes, John?
Point of interest, where was that schoolhouse located?
That's the question. That's the question of the hour, and that's Sally's trying to figure that out for a Cal Poly professor. We know from a book that Janet Ferris wrote about Avila, Eclipse of Yesterday. That's not the right title, I can't think of it. She wrote that it was in a canyon behind Port Hartford.
I've heard, and I don't know how accurate this is, that it was pretty much where the guardhouse is.
That's what we think. That's what we all
Is
think.
that right? Is that so?
That's what we all think, but we're trying to see. We've got to figure that out. You know, because the kids at the Lighthouse, they walked
Right.
on foot every day to and from that port school. You know, dodging cattle and getting ticks and
Railroad tracks.
trying to avoid railroad track, trying to avoid rattlesnakes and so on. So the actual place where that school is has yet to be determined. Let's just say that. So in 1920, George Waters and his family arrived at the Lighthouse. They replaced William Smith. And Waters on the left was one of the Port School trustees. And then Dorothy is the little girl in the glasses. She graduated from the Port School in 1926 and was complimented by her teacher for her perfect attendance record, neither absent nor tardy throughout her 6 years at the school, having successfully navigated cattle, ticks, and rattlesnakes. Dorothy's mother, Della, is on the right, and the woman in the hat is a family friend. So leaving Sunny's room, we'll cross the hall and we will enter the bedroom we call Lucy's room, which faces south and west. It's the only bedroom without a fireplace, but the chimney from the kitchen comes up through this room and so would have kept it warm. Lucy's mother married Bob Moorfield in 1929 when Lucy was 7 years years old. And Lucy says the first time she came to the light station was on her mother's wedding day. And as you might imagine, it was quite a transition, moving from San Luis Obispo to the Lighthouse. The school she attended in San Luis, the Emerson School, had around 25 students per class. The Port School never had more than 10 or 15 pupils in the entire building. I'm watching the time, so I might speed up a little. Among Lucy's passions in life were books and literacy. Her teachers commented that she had a prodigious vocabulary and that she loved to use big words. She earned a master's in library science from UC Berkeley, and she worked for 20 years as a district librarian for the Richmond School District in Northern California. And she came back during the restoration period and shared her memories of living in this house with those people who were doing the restoration work. So leaving Lucy's room, we'll head back downstairs. If we look inside the kitchen on the right, you can see the telephone. It was part of a call bell system, an intercom system, so to speak, that connected the dwellings, the lighthouse, and the fog signal building so that the keepers could easily communicate with each other. So now we're going to exit by the dwelling's front door, and then we're going to make an immediate right, and we're going to open the door to the attached lighthouse. Square tower, 40 feet high, not very tall by lighthouse standards, but it's situated on a bluff 90 feet above sea level. So we're inside the tower now. We're going to climb the stairs. They're narrow and steep, make a couple of turns. Guests hold on to the railing and the upright posts that support the railing, and I'll tell you right now, not everyone chooses to make the trip to the top, nor do we want them to. We want to make sure that people know before climbing the steps and then ascending the ladder that, you know, it's not for you if you've got bad knees, you've got bad hips, you're afraid of heights, you've got claustrophobia. And I had a guest a while ago, and I went through all of that as a docent, you know, all those statements, and the guest went up and got to the top and to the lantern room and said to me, "Kathy, I can't get back down." So we used to throw her a sandwich, you know, every now and again, but we stopped doing that after a while. I did have one young man on one of my tours. When I said that, he looked at me very seriously and said, "What kind of sandwich?" As if he was contemplating kind of staying up there. We'd throw him a PB&J. Anyway, as we climb the stairs, notice the windows in the tower. Guests like to grab onto the window ledges for support. And finally, we reach a landing called the watch room. You can see a little table that was probably used for making entries in the station's logbook. And then just up these few steps is a ladder with handrails. And here we are climbing the ladder. Guests use the handrails as they climb each rung of the ladder. And then you can just see the lantern room at the top of the ladder through the open trap door. And here's where we pop out through the trap door, and now we're on the floor of the lantern room. And then once inside, this 8-sided glass, iron, and brass lantern room. Guests have panoramic views when the weather's not foggy. You can also see a small cast iron doors leading to the gallery deck that goes around the lantern room, and the keepers use the doors to wash the outside window panes every day, just as they wash the inside window panes. You can notice the brass air vent used to regulate the flow of air and keep the light burning bright, and too little or too much air would affect the light. And notice that there's a light, of course, in the lantern room, but we will see the light later. Here's another view from the lantern room, looking at it San Luis Bay on a clear day. Notice the brass curtain hooks at the top of each window pane. Keepers hung curtains during the day to shield the glass prisms of the lens and the kerosene lamp from the sun. And here's a view of the ceiling of the lantern room. Notice the vent, which allows the heat and the fumes from the kerosene lamp inside the lens to escape. And this historic image with the lens inside gives us a better view of the lantern room ceiling. And then leaving the lantern room, the next challenge is climbing down the ladder, and of course you tell your guests, you don't face forward going down the ladder, you back down, it's a ladder, using the handrails to lower yourself carefully down each rung of the ladder. And then once we've come off the ladder, we'll descend the tower steps, and you encourage your guests to take their time and to go slowly. So having done that, we'll exit the lighthouse, descend the outside stairs, turn left, pass by the coal shed, which you can just see on your right, open the gray double doors, and enter the fog signal building. Now initially the fog signal was a steam-powered whistle, and its signature was a 5-second blast every 35 seconds. The water used to create the steam was pumped into boilers from the cisterns outside and then heated using coal. In 1915, the whistle was replaced by an air siren powered by compressed air using a gasoline-powered air compressor. Its new signature was a 4-second blast every 40 seconds. And this rare 1915 photograph was taken inside the fog signal building's engine room just after the new equipment was installed. Changing the fog signal from a steam whistle to compressed air meant that the fog signal could be sounded almost instantaneously when low visibility conditions approached, instead of waiting a full 30 minutes for the boilers to get up steam. This image taken in 1894 shows the fog signal building with the steam-powered whistles and the smokestacks on top. And there were 2 sets of whistles and boilers, a primary and a backup, because everything was in duplicate. To the left of the fog signal building are the coal house, or the coal shed, the keeper's dwelling, the attached lighthouse, and the oil house, and to the right is the duplex where the keeper's assistants lived. Here's another view of the steam whistles, and the smokestacks, and the rainwater catch basin with fencing surrounding it, and this image was taken in 1890 while the light station was still under construction. This is an indoor view of the fog signal building's engine room as it is today. You've all seen this. It's set up as a mini museum with signage and displays for guests to view at their leisure after the walking tour is over. Here's another view of the engine room with its signage and displays, and the equipment is more modern than the equipment that was installed in 1950, and of course the horns that you see would have been outside the building and not inside. I'll go through this real quick. From the engine room, we'll move to a side room, which used to be the tool room, where our 4th order Fresnel lens is on display. The podium that the lens and pedestal stand on is an exact footprint of the floor of the lantern room where we just were. The lens was made in France in 1878. It says that right at the base of the lens. You don't have to write it down, you can just see it, it says it right there. It came to the light station in 1890, and it's the original lighting apparatus that was used until an automated beacon was installed outside in 1974. It's called a Fresnel lens after its inventor, Augustin Fresnel. He invented his lens in 1822. He was a French physicist with a special interest in optics, and he was a member of Napoleon's Lighthouse Board, and he wanted stronger lights for the lighthouses along the coast of France. At first, a kerosene lamp inside the lens was used to produce the light, and when electricity came to the light station, a 500-watt lamp with clear incandescent bulbs replaced the kerosene lamp, and there were always 2 bulbs in case one burned out, and this lamp is in a display case in the lens room. In this image, you can see what the light bulbs look like inside the lens. So our Fresnel lens has 10 flash panels, each with a bullseye lens in the middle, 4 prisms below each bullseye, and 6 prisms above, so 110 pieces of glass in all. The design of the lens allowed it to concentrate, magnify, refract, and reflect light, creating a solid horizontal beam shooting out across the water. And the whole apparatus revolves, creating the illusion of a blinking or flashing light. Notice the chariot wheels. In 1890, The lens alternated between red and white flashes at 30-second intervals. In 1912, the ruby screens attached to the outside of the lens, which produced the red flashes, they were removed, and its new characteristic became a white flash at 20-second intervals. Now, this is fun. I love doing this. This slide on the next two show you what the light looked as it flashed throughout the night. Oops, kind of cool, huh? Yeah, kind of fun. The lens had a clockwork mechanism with a gearbox and a large weight attached to a cable that dropped through the floor of the lantern rim to the bottom of the tower actually the bottom of the watch rim operated the gears, and this would cause the lens to revolve. The clockwork mechanism regulated the speed of the revolution, and keepers would use the L-shaped crank to rewind the cable several times a night to keep the lens revolving. The lens was moved after the station was automated to protect it from vandalism. It was removed from the tower in March of 1976, a joint effort on the part of the Coast Guard and the Harbor District, because people were coming by water, which you could still do even though all the land surrounding the light station by then was owned by PG&E, the buffer lands for the power plant. So you couldn't come by road, you couldn't come by foot, no public access, but you could come by water, and people did, and they brought shotguns and they used the lens for target practice. And so to protect it from bullet holes, it was removed in March of 1976. Spent some time in the county's history center, the old Carnegie Library, and our main library downtown SLO. But in 2010, it was returned to the light station, still owned by the Coast Guard, which baffles me since they abandoned it. But it's on what we hope is a permanent loan to the Point San Luis Lighthouse Keepers. And that concludes the virtual tour. Any questions or comments? Yes, thank you.
Kathy, do we know if our Fresnel lens served anywhere else besides Point San Luis?
So the question that John is asking is, since it was made in Paris in 1878 and it was installed here in 1890, what happened to it during the 12 years between its manufacture and when it was installed at Point San Luis in 1890? And I know that Wayne Wheeler wrote an article a while ago, some years ago, saying that it had been used at a different lighthouse, and I can't recall right now which one that was. But later research has determined that that was not the case. And the best that I can guess, which I don't like doing, is that it was simply held in inventory at the Lighthouse Services main supply depot, which is on Staten Island in New York City. And in fact, the lantern or the lens, the lantern that when you go up through the trapdoor, that's where you are, you're in the lantern. That wasn't made here, that was machined on Staten Island at the main supply depot, and it was shipped here and assembled on site. And we know this from research and correspondence, but also if we didn't, you could kind of guess, because on the brass pieces in the lantern are little Roman numerals, like Roman numeral 4, Roman numeral 5, Roman numeral 6. It's kind of like you bought a kit from IKEA and then you have these instructions to put it together, and you know, it's just about as clear as how you might assemble this lantern on site. So anyway, my guess is that it was simply kept in inventory on Staten Island at that main supply depot until it was needed, and then it was shipped out here. Yeah, and we actually have correspondence shipping it from the quartermaster there at the supply depot out here to San Francisco and then down here to San Luis Obispo. Yes?
You said FDR changed the regulations, gave it to the Coast Guard. Did he do that because the war was coming?
Yeah, the winds of war. I'm pretty sure. In 1939, we were not in coining the word yet, but the writing was on the wall, and so I do think that that made sense to
And the
do
other
that.
question, the paint colors that are in the building now, are those original or are they just assumed to be what people were using?
The idea of painting the rooms lead with dark brown trim is pretty standard for the Lighthouse, and the only exception to that is Lucy's room. And because Lucy said that she remembered that her room was seafoam green with dark green trim, so I understand that those who did the restoration painted it that color scheme because that's what she recalled. But yeah, that standard color scheme of gray and dark brown, yeah, pretty standard Lighthouse service fare, yeah.
Then just to comment about the Port School, lots of little one-room schoolhouses, they usually are what you call common school. They graduate, you go to the 8th grade and you graduate, and that's as far as most people go. A high school will exist in a big city, or like in San Luis Obispo, there's probably a high school, and people, and that's so Lucy had to go to, if she wanted to go to high school, which she did, then she goes to San Luis. But most people, including all four of my grandparents, you go 8th grade and that's it.
So the good news is that Sonny and Lucy and Burton Gross, who was also in that 1930s picture of the students and their teacher at the Port School, they went to middle school in SLO and they went to SLO high school. In fact, Elsie, Edna, and Bessie, Will Smith's kids, the girls, they also went to San Luis High. And then they went on to San Jose Normal School, which we now call San Jose State, to get their teaching credentials. And the way that they did that, to be able to go on, was to board in town. And then you come back and you visit dad during school breaks and summer vacations. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Any other questions?
Do we have reports of how they dealt with the noise from the whistles?
Oh my goodness. If you read the book, the Coast Guard people always commented on how difficult it was at first to be able to sleep through the sound of and the steam whistle was not as loud as the air siren, which was not as loud as the diaphone. So every time they upgraded to a different kind of fog signal, it got worse and worse. And it got so bad that you'd have, Philip knows the thing where you start a conversation and then you have to stop. And then you talk again and stop and talk. And so they got kind of used to the stop and start. Because sometimes that fog signal would sound for days. So it was tough. Yeah.
Yeah, on the parcel, another reason that you change out the coal boilers, as you said, it takes 45 minutes or so for them to heat up. So you're keeping the water hot all the time. You don't ever let it go to room temperature, really, because you can't start it.
Right.
It costs about, in those dollars in that area, it costs about $2,000 a year to stoke those things with coal. And so, which is huge, considering that the salary of a keeper is like $800 a year. And so, putting on compressor is a huge saving. That's why they do it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So was there a keeper on duty 24 hours?
Well, you had 3 keepers.
Yeah.
So, somebody had to be tending the light, somebody had to be looking, because how do you know fog's approaching? You're sitting in a watch room and you're watching for fog approaching, and then somebody's not. So, between the 3 of them,
rotate.
and of course, there were no women lighthouse keepers officially, but there were wives and there were family members. And when a keeper went on leave, they could hire what they called it like a temporary labor, and they got these people from Port San Luis. So local folks would come out and they would do temporary duty. They were called laborers, but they were basically keepers, so that the keepers could have vacation, could have leave, and that's how they did that. Basically temporary keepers.
There
Makes
were
sense?
women keepers at other stations, just not here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, there were definitely women keepers at other stations, just not here officially. I would like to say that because I suspect that.
Yeah.
Yes, Scott.
Were the lapels digits or Roman numerals?
There were numbers.
And then, you mentioned the to be a male and married with children in order to be a lighthouse keeper. Now that never sat right with me because I knew in Santa Barbara that was the first woman lighthouse keeper.
Emily Fish.
Yeah, but it's a
Yeah.
weird situation because
Yeah.
her husband and she's a widower.
Yeah.
But
Her husband was an inspector,
oh, okay.
Emily Fish.
And then when he died, they're like, oh yeah, keep going. Otherwise you can destitute
Right.
more.
So here, but there's.
But that's blew my
no, but
mind.
No, but you're partially right. Let me explain. So we have two different eras. We have the Lighthouse era and we have the Coast Guard era, okay? Coast Guard takes over after FDR changes it and puts it under Coast Guard control. So, Coast Guard era, after World War II, you had to be married to be stationed at Point San Luis, and your wife had to live there with you, presumably to cook and clean for you. And there were many, many children who were born in San Luis Obispo while their parents were stationed at Point San Luis with the Coast Guard. So during the Lighthouse era, in fact, sometimes there were some light stations where you couldn't take your family. They were like St. George's Reef. They were way too remote. Farallon Islands, actually, Captain Young and his family, his young family, they were actually there on the Farallons from 1887 to 1890. So we got his family there. But yeah, during the Lighthouse era, your marital status really didn't matter at Point San Luis. But when the Coast Guard took over, it was after World War II, you had to be married to live there. And you had children, but when your youngest child, your oldest child was school age, this is Coast Guard, not Lighthouse. Your oldest child became school age, the Coast Guard rotated you out. You had to report every month through Coast Guard channels the age or the date of birth rather of your oldest child, and they monitored that because I guess they didn't think it was such a great idea for the Coast Guard kids to be, walking the trail to the port school, or later on because the port school only lasted until 1940. So Coast Guard comes in 1939. There's no port school. If they want to go to school, they've got to go to Avila to the two-room schoolhouse. And how do you get to the Avila schoolhouse from the Point San Luis Light Station? You either go by foot, because there's no road until the 1960s, or you go by water. And that was too much of a burden for the Coast Guard people who were stationed there to be taking the kids by a boat to school in Avila, so they just transferred the family.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.